Hello students, and welcome to Chapter 1 of your book. In today's slideshow, we are going to look at a number of things from the early part of our country's history. Some of them kind of awful, rather awful, which I think is going to be no surprise to anybody. But we're covering the 17th century to the 1820s, and I'm not going to cover every single thing on every single slide, simply because your second test for this is going to be on chapters 1 and 2, and it's got 20 questions. So I'm going to hit the things that are important for you to know for your quiz number 2, and I'm going to let you read the PowerPoint on your own or read the book on your own as you desire. So in this chapter, we're going to look at ideas behind the question, when and where does African American art history start? Because, well, it's hard to tell, because unfortunately African Americans were being brought into the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade, and one might think that an enslaved people may not have any way of creating art or any recourse for creating art. However, that art-making impulse is really strong, and people found ways to express themselves. So sometimes it may be hard to date things, and there are some things such as quilts, things that are made out of fabric, things that might have been made out of paper. Those things are the first things to disintegrate, so we may not even have the very earliest artworks made. I'm quite sure we don't. But what we do have are a few things, and they give us some insight into what might have been going on through people's minds and how people were trying to deal with their new situation. So Africans were taken into slavery and shipped across the Atlantic from early in the 16th century until the second half of the 19th century, and nearly half of those were transported during the 18th century. And approximately 14 million Africans survived the Atlantic crossing, and they left behind their material culture. And what that means, material culture is essentially everything that you need to live your life. So material culture for us in the 21st century can be things like a mouse computer thing, computer mouse, iPhone, material culture, my tape dispenser, material culture, the office chair I'm sitting on, that's material culture. So when I say they left behind their material culture, I'm saying they left behind all the little things, little and big things that go into making up your life. So in spite of the fact that people were brought here against their will, that they were brought here without anything from their homeland, they were still cultural beings who carried their homeland and their various ways of approaching and interpreting life inside of them. And so those are usually the things that get expressed through artwork and through other ways. So once people were congregated in the New World, they did form communities, and they developed new means of meeting their expressive and artistic needs, the same that they had felt in Africa. And early on, in some cases, Africans speaking the same language from the same cultural group were gathered together on plantations, especially in the Caribbean and in Brazil. Later in the Americas, this was not the case for sure, and in North America. But for example, in Brazil, they have a very large Yoruban community. So recognizable cultural practices from their homeland in those cases were able to be revived and continued. And often cultural influences from several areas of Africa might meld together, particularly once slave owners kind of got wise to, we better not group together people who speak the same language. They might rebel. So sometimes you have what we call syncretism, which is a blending together of cultures and ideas. So in some cases we'll see things that are syncretic, where they're melding together different influences from different parts of Africa. American colonists might have stolen labor from the Africans, but they could not steal their cultural heritage or their identities. So the Haitian religious practice that is known as voodoo or voodoo, colloquially combines Yoruba, Congo, and Dahomean elements. And in the United States, slave owners who feared rebellions tried to group together people actually did not want to group people together. As I said, they wanted to suppress communication and collaboration. In spite of that, people were able to find out what was common amongst them, as people do, and then they expressed themselves in ways that are reminiscent of their home cultural practices, although they might have become more generalized. And voodoo is not really something, I know a lot of people fear voodoo because there's a lot of misconceptions about it, but it is the one religion from West Africa that came across the transatlantic and made it here. So there's a lot more to it than I think people realize, and we will look at some of those revivals and practices and how they impact people in different ways as we go through this summer session. So one reason that Africans became the primary slave labor in the New World is that they are visibly different because of the color of their skins, and unlike white indentured servants, they couldn't just melt into the free white population. And I'm sure you've heard the stories, of indentured servants. Essentially, indentured servitude was brought on where there's a scarcity of labor. And so you might have somebody, say, who's Irish, from Ireland, and their families move to the New World, and they don't have the means to get across the Atlantic. So they might enter into a contract for a specific period of indenture, after which they would be set free. So, two ways in which they're different from slaves. They're able to be free after a period of time, and they can also blend should they choose to escape. So blacks remained in the labor pool and basically were a profitable long-term solution to the labor shortage in the Americas. And here we have a lovely gussied-up version of the Emancipation Proclamation. And even though slavery was abolished by that, there's still, as we know, racism that for decades and centuries has continued to affect aspiration, status, and the consciousness of Black people. And the social restrictions and obstacles that early people faced affected the production of art. And you need to think about these things when we're looking at the social and historical factors, when we're looking at the work of African American artists. And the making and appreciating of fine art, in other words, being able to buy it and collect it and exhibit it, was mostly a European thing. It was a middle or upper class activity. And so because Black people were socially and economically oppressed, it's very difficult to pursue this kind of career. People think of it as a luxury, not as a means of self-expression necessarily. And we see that prior to the second half of the 20th century. Also, it's difficult for people, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, it's difficult for African Americans to get accepted into art schools based on their color. So there's a number of reasons why it's difficult. However, we have folk art, which I gave you guys the definition of in the introductory PowerPoint, and that was less encumbered by racism and probably flourished because segregation left Black communities more intact socially to develop as subcultures, and so folk artists are drawing on the culture of the people around them and the communities around them. So more likely to be bought by other Black people. And one of the things we will see as we go through this session is white people seem to have a proclivity for exoticizing Black culture. So in that way, folk art becomes popular sometimes. We'll get to that. So this is one of those things that is not in your book, actually, and it's not on any of the tests. However, I think it's really interesting to know about, so I encourage you to read these slides on your own about the African burial ground in New York City, mainly because there are things that were discovered there that show some of the material culture that people had as slaves, and some things that might have been revivals of African practices and symbols. Example, this is the burial site of a young woman who was buried with 111 beads. And if you take African art with me, you'll see how beads are often a sign of status in Africa. So clearly this was probably someone who was important from her homeland, and even though she's far from her homeland, in death she's being honored as if she was a princess or whatever her title may have been. So meanwhile, in the South, we have architecture in the plantation, and the reason we're looking at that is because once slaves were brought over to this the New World, they often had to build their own homes. And looking at this slide, I want you to notice how we've got the plantation house, the big house where the white people live, is right up here. And then you've got this line of trees, and then all the way back here you've got the slave houses. And so they thought that this was kind of a hierarchical thing, and that, hey, this is, the important master of the plantation, and he's up here, and the slaves are back here. However, what happens is, as it says in the slide, there's a cultural subversion and a resistance that's achieved because of this layout, because basically those slave houses are, kind of protected by the trees, and generally white people did not go back into the area where slaves were living. So they were able to kind of, in their off time, what little of it they had, to do their own thing. So as I said, they arrived here with the conceptual and technological skills required to build their own homes. And we have a lot of African continuities that we see in the construction of these homes, like this one here. There's the steep pitched roof that provides shade, and the steep pitched roof, which then creates the porch, is really an African thing. We have a front porch because of people coming over from Africa, coming over from a hot climate, knowing how to develop something that is going to be better in the very hot climate. So we see this evidence, as it says, of African continuities and a syncretism, which alters the exterior appearance of these little homes, but it's not necessarily also that alters it, but basically from Africa what we see is a preference for small spaces and the way in which space is used. And houses that were built between 1650 and 1700 resembled homes that were in West and Central Africa, and they had floors of beaten dirt called pisé, and then thatched reed or palmetto leaf roofs, which you're seeing here, wattle and daub, tabby or clay wall construction, which I will explain what that means. So individual houses were usually about 10 or feet 12 square, and they often looked like, little peasant cottages from the British Isles, so newly arrived planters didn't see anything unusual there, and these houses stood for at least a generation. And then over time, there were some variations because they would adopt and adapt some European features, such as chimneys, using logs, timber frames, brick and mortar, and also a two-story elevation like you see here. Generally in Africa, you don't have two stories. And planters really wanted to impose their cultural values over the slaves, but this architectural landscape made the slaves able to subvert the authority. So what we're looking at here is the East Coast, the southern East Coast of the United States, and you see South Carolina coming down into Florida, and then the Caribbean. And that coastal strip that goes all the way from Charleston, South Carolina to the St. Johns River in northern Florida is often considered by historians to be the northernmost extension of the West Indies, which, that's what they called them when Columbus discovered them, because he thought he was finding India, except it was on the other side of the world. So it became known as the West Indies. And the first permanent English settlers came from Barbados in 1670, and they brought their slaves with them, and they wanted to build a plantation colony in South Carolina. And planters turned to rice, which African slaves knew how to grow and harvest. And actually, rice becomes a major staple, especially amongst what are known as the Gullah people or the Geechee people who live on the barrier islands along South Carolina. We're going to see them a little bit later this session. So here is a close-up of South Carolina and all those little tiny islands all along there. And what's very interesting is a lot of times there would be kind of subcultures that would grow up on these little tiny islands. And this is where we get the Gullah people or the Geechee people. And as I said, we will look at them a little bit later, because they, by living apart on these islands, they were able to maintain a lot of African practices. But coming back to Chapter 1 here, by 1708, blacks made up 50% of the population, and by 1730, there were an estimated 30,000 settlers, of whom 20,000 were blacks. So very interesting. And a Swiss person came to Carolina in 1737, and he said it looks more like a Negro country than a country settled by white people. And South Carolina's black culture, initially West Indian, and then after 1730, mostly from Angola, which is where we get the word Gullah. We think it evolved from Angola. Was more African than that of any other colony in British North America. So life on the plantations. This is actually an artist's rendition of what they think life might have been like for slaves. So African culture gradually reemerges in South Carolina. For instance, we'll look at the Caribou Plantation, which was established in 1740 by French Huguenots. They were French Protestants who had been religiously persecuted in Europe, and so they came to the Americas for religious freedom. In any case, they're 70 miles north of Charleston, and in 1983, two archaeologists discovered that there were slave houses dating from the mid-1700s, which were narrow, rectangular, single and double unit buildings without chimneys. So first they were built by digging trenches into the ground to hold the foundations, and this is an artist's rendering of what that might have looked like. Things like this tend to not last because, well, they disintegrate over time. But they were built over courses of clay reinforced with upright posts laid in the bottom of the trenches and then built up to the desired height. And alternatively, they might have been constructed of upright posts woven with sticks or wattles and packed with clay, which is called wattle and daub construction. That is on your test. And at the Caribou Plantation, hearths and fireplaces were outside the home, which you would see in many West and Central African compounds or living quarters. So generally in Africa, things are hot. You keep your house small, and you don't spend a lot of time inside except at night. Basically, the house, the interior is for sleeping and for more intimate grown-up activities. And then outside, you might have, well, here we have a nice porch, which provides the shade, and that's where cooking takes place. So if your cooking is outside, you don't need a chimney in the house. And it might have seemed to a slave master that, this was, the way he had ordered things was showing the ideal representation of race and class. However, unwittingly, he was reinforcing a landscape that was familiar to his slaves. And by, having them so far from the mansion, they were able to, as I said, in their off hours, to be left to their own devices. And so basically what begins to happen in the 17th and 18th century, we have African and Afro-Caribbean slaves creating their own distinctive subculture and an African-American way of life in the shadow of the slave master. And as I mentioned earlier, generally white people did not intrude on this. They wouldn't go into this, the black world because, well, you just don't do that. So from dusk to dawn and on holidays and the Sabbath, there was no work, and slaves were on their own. Come on, baby. Oops. Here we go. So we're going to look at a planter's house, and one that is particularly unusual. This is the home of a woman named Marie Therese. She was a slave. Her parents were born in Africa, but she had a French lover. This was not unusual in that time, and there's actually a whole body of literature about these marriages between young women who maybe their skins were lighter or they were just attractive, and the Frenchmen would take them as their mistresses and give them their own homes and have a whole second family with them while still having his wife, who was white, and his children in another place. But I guess these guys were wealthy enough to do all that juggling. But in any case, this woman, her lover must have really loved her because he granted her 70 acres of land in 1778. His name was Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer, which I mention him because sometimes this is called the Metoyer plantation, also known as the Melrose. No, yes? I'll know in a minute, plantation. So in any case, he gave her 70 acres of land, and there she established a tobacco and an indigo plantation. And by 1832, because along with the French, the Spanish also occupied Louisiana at one point. By 1832, through Spanish land grants and subsequent purchases, the Creole Metoyer family held over 10,000 acres of land, and they had the largest number of slaves owned by free blacks in the United States. But we're going to look at the architecture of her house and how it was influenced. And if you look at this building here, so it's got 2 stories, as I said, and the thing that you can kind of see here is this acts as a hallway, essentially. It's an outdoor hallway. You don't have your hallways in the house. You walk outside, and I think all of that is meant to try to keep breezes going and to try to keep the cool in and the heat out. And on the plantation located Isle Breville near Natchitoches, she built in 1798 a very distinctive architectural design. This is African House, and it was a storehouse. It was used much the way a West African granary would be used. It was a place to keep your grains, to keep insects and rodents and other varmints away from it. So it's one room. It's got a very steep roof, and you see this to this day. And actually, this looks a lot like the Creole cottages that we will see a bit later on. So slaves were probably the ones to build the house, and here you can see a bit of the structure and how that big steep roof comes out. And this was used by early Louisiana French Creole homes. It was built by slaves for white planters. You have at ground level soft whitewashed bricks, and they're supporting a loft made with timbers, and that's filled in with moss, mud, and deer hair. And then at the half story, which would be like a loft, we have these cypress beams, and they support this large hipped roof. And so far, there's no other similar structure documented in Louisiana or the South. However, as I said, we will see some Creole cottages that bear some resemblance, I think. And on the same plantation, there's 2 additional structures, homes, that were built, one during Marie Therese's lifetime, the Yucca House, dating from 1796 to 1800, and that's in the style of a rural colonial Louisiana home. It's 1-story, mud post construction. There is a chimney here, and there's a rear gallery, and again, a large hipped roof. And so this is a close-up of the house that we saw back here. So I just wanted you to get a glimpse of this again before we go to the close-up. And again, this is a house style that is that of a French Creole planter's mansion, based on the West Indian, in other words, French African-inspired design, and it was meant to accommodate a hot, humid climate such as you might have in Louisiana. And these are 1.5-story mansions, and they were up in use up until the last quarter of the 19th century. Again, you've got this wide, steeped dormer roof, rooms that open onto, they call this the gallery, with no interior hallway. So you have to walk outside to get into the other rooms, and then there's a deep veranda and brick columns and a raised main floor, which basically your main floor down here is a basement. So the other thing that we will look at, because people were not making a lot of what we call fine art at this time, and but what I mean by fine art is things like painting and sculpture and drawings, those sorts of things. You're seeing more like craftsmen, things like furniture, metal smithing, ceramics, quilts, and that sort of thing. So the history of Black American artists and craftsmen in colonial times is brief and incomplete. We get some facts from written accounts, succession and judicial records, runaway ads like the ones that you see here. And a lot of people did not want to look at this because, well, it's not pleasant to look at. But one of the things that people are trying to do now is to look at cultural production and to look at things that people made, artifacts and crafts, as art, as people's expressions. And in general, there were slave artisans. They were of greater value than untrained slaves. You would find them, on a ship manifest saying, this person is a metalsmith. This person knows how to work with wood. This person is a potter. This person is a weaver. And in towns and cities, they were very valuable. And among the highly valued slaves were male carpenters and carpenter joiners and blacksmiths. And they actually built the South, pretty much. The majority of plantation structures, service buildings, the main house, architectural ornamentation, etc. So, again, on Melrose Plantation, we have here a weaving house, and this would be a place where slaves were trained in spinning and weaving, lace making, intricate needlework, and embroidery. And basically, we also have a shift in gender roles, because in West Africa, it's generally the male who does the weaving of cloth. Women might dye it, women might put designs on it, but the men are the weavers. So switches over into this country, the women are the weavers and the sewers, and what begins to happen is women become important financially to the slave owner because they can produce things that can be sold if their crops fail. So they can do crops, and a lot of times textiles were so highly regarded that slaveholders would have very successful weaving enterprises. This is before the Industrial Revolution. Clothes and fabric were not easy to come by. Everything had to be made by hand. So if you can have a production of that, there's a need for it, you can make money from it. Bed quilts were the most valued household objects. Of course, as I mentioned, because fabric does not hold up through time, most of the quilts that were made before 1775 have been lost. The ones that survive are associated with wealthy slave-owning plantations, and fabric, because again, everything had to be made by hand. So fabric was very expensive before the Industrial Revolution. So when your clothes wore out, say if your seams got funny or whatever, you didn't throw that away. You would save the scraps that would work, and then you could recycle them into patchwork, and you could also call these pieced or quilts. And the earliest dated slave-made quilt that we have, it's a pieced quilt from Beaver Dam Plantation in Hanover County, Virginia, has a bit of an unusual feature. Bits of woven fabrics instead of expensive imported printed textiles, which is what you usually find. So basically what we're seeing is black women taking a popular European and European American technique and transforming it into their own African American folk idiom. And I want to see if I can get a date on that quilt. I'm surprised I don't have it in here already. Quilt. Where are you? No, it just says late 18th century. So, all right. So in Africa, these are some pieces where we see men had been in charge of weaving the textiles. And what we're seeing here is this is the strip cloth of the Ashanti people known as kente. And then on the right is applique, which comes from the kingdom of Dahomey. So both of these techniques become adopted into the Americas and used as patterns. So again, slave artisans made well-crafted objects for their own use. The earliest dated artifacts of black culture were found on Virginia plantations. Here we see there's a wrought iron statue of a human figure and a wooden drum. Both of these show some continuance of African cultural practices. What exactly they were used for by the people who created them, we don't necessarily know. What is interesting, this drum in particular, I'm pointing at it like you can see me pointing at it, is of a Khan design. So that means people from Ghana or the Côte d'Ivoire, and this was a talking drum. In Ghana, we'll see in Akan peoples, they have drums that they use that mimic human speech. And so white colonialists were very threatened by drums because they thought that it would be a way for slaves to send messages to one another. So generally, drums were outlawed. So having this drum is kind of an unusual and kind of a cool thing. And then blacksmiths are very important in African society because they can craft things from raw metal ore into beautiful, useful things. So you can see here, this is a very beautiful horse and rider from the Bamana people who live in Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, Ghana. And they create things that look a lot like this. So when we see a figure like this, he almost looks as though he could be sitting on a horse, which I think is interesting. And this was found buried in the floor of a blacksmith shop in slave quarters in Alexandria, Virginia. So again, we don't know, why the individual who made this made it, but it must have had some purpose or meaning to him. And then pottery. People use pottery, and pottery is often thought of as being utilitarian, but we do see proof that earthenware was made at plantations and it was made by slaves. And in particular in 1930s, we have undecorated fragments of unglazed low-fire earthenware. And this becomes known as Colonial ware, which I'll elaborate on. But generally what you see are examples a lot like this one. This is a very simple jug. A lot of times they're found by accident, but then a lot of art history is found by accident. But you can see it's very simple. It does retain an African form, and it also has marks incised into it, as you can see. So there's a bit of creativity going on there. So in 1978, Leland Ferguson came up with the term Colonial ware, and sometimes we hear Colonial Indian ware, and it's the merging of two traditions. So again, it's syncretic. We have the North American Indian and the African American. So Indians would sell their earthenware to whites, and then they would give them to the slaves. Blacks probably bought their own pieces, and then as contact occurs between the blacks and the Indians, slaves began making their own pottery as they had in West and Central Africa. And again, these are the kinds of shapes that you would see in West Africa. Very curved bottom bowls, large and small globe-shaped jugs, just like this. And what's interesting is we see another indication of African culture that probably a white person would just pass by. We see marks of often crosses, as you see here, which that cross represents a symbol of the cosmos from the Congo. So that's kind of interesting, and also images that look like they could be ladders of some kind. And vessels like these might have been used to propitiate water or ancestral spirits. And then here is an outline of the whole cosmology of the Congo people. And if you want, you can do some research on this and see how there's other revivals in the United States. For example, the story of the devil at the crossroads. Slaves became Christianized in this country, and so when people are trying to convert other people, they make whatever it is they worship into the devil, and so that's kind of where that comes from. So another thing that happens is people living in cities and towns develop artisanal skills. They're able to do metalworking, they're able to do cabinet making, and several things might happen to someone like this. So they might be able to run north with their trade and their knowledge and make a living, or they might be able to earn money on their own and purchase their freedom, or having learned a skill, say the white person that trained them might do manumission, which is basically where they free them, or upon their deathbed they free their slaves. That was not uncommon if a person wanted to do that and wasn't a complete jerk. So this is by Thomas Goss, and I'm not going to talk a lot about these again because they're not on the test, so again, you can read this on your own if you like, but these are some examples of the kinds of furniture that were being made by black people in the early Americas. This was from Thomas Goss. He was actually a free man in Philadelphia, and he learned the trade from his father, who was probably also a free man in Philadelphia, or at least for part of his life. And then Peter Benson was a silversmith. He was originally apprenticed to a silversmith in 1791, and he worked in Philadelphia. He also worked in St. Croix, and a lot of times silversmiths sign their work, so we have 9 pieces that we know that he made. And this is another one here. And also the fact that he had the mobility, he had the freedom to travel between the American mainland and the Caribbean, and that's unusual for artists of African descent in the period leading up to the Civil War. So he's significant in that way. This is from Moses Williams. He was a formerly enslaved man, also from Philadelphia, and he grew up in the home of Charles Willson Peale, and one of the things that he was famous for was creating hollow cut paper silhouettes of members of the extended Peale family. The Peale family were kind of like the Kardashians of their day. They people running around having love affairs, and they just didn't have TV to document everything. They have all that remains are these silhouettes, and so what you get is you get an impression. You get the profile, you get the curve of the face, and maybe the curl of some hair. Maybe on a larger person you might have a double chin or a slack neck. So just very interesting. And a few months before he began this work, when he had turned 27, he was manumitted or freed by Peale in accordance with the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. They didn't want to hurry into anything, I guess. It was adopted by the Pennsylvania legislature in 1780, and it was required that freedom be granted to enslaved people when they reached the age of 28. And so Williams was actually freed a year earlier than required, and then he was offered employment at the Peale Museum in Philadelphia. And so here you see some more examples of his silhouettes of the Peale family. And again, I will let you guys read this on your own, but he's an interesting guy to kind of look into, and the Peels, we will hear from them later. So here we have, now we're going to talk a little bit about fine artists, although as I mentioned, there were not a lot of them. But after the War of Independence, there was accelerated urbanization and wealth in America. And in major American cities, the number of white artists, fine artists, increased twofold. And then we also had European portrait painters coming over who wanted to make, their way and make money in the New World. And we also have white American-born portrait painters. And so if you were wealthy, the thing to do to show off your wealth was to commission a painter to do your portrait. And so everybody wanted to get on this bandwagon, and people who were originally trained as house painters or sign painters were known as limners. And limners were generally self-taught and began to do portrait paintings of their own. And they worked in what we call a naive style or a folk style, simply meaning that they were not trained at an art school. And they were active until the early 19th century, and the most famous of them all was Joshua Johnston of African Americans. He's really the first African American painter to be really successful. And in general, again, there's obvious economic and social disadvantages for African Americans, whether they're slave or free. And again, people tend to not buy art or make art unless they have the luxury to do so. But a few slaves and free blacks did become graphic artists, draftsmen, and commercial portrait painters, such as Joshua Johnston. And we're looking at portraits that he did on these slides. So the first documented, I have to fix the typos on this, but I'm going to just keep talking for now. So the first documented African American poet in the United States is Phyllis Wheatley. You may have heard her name in other classes. She had been a slave born in Gambia, West Africa. She called herself Afric's Muse, and as a black woman, she was unable to get her poetry published in this country. And so she went to London, and they were like, yes, we will publish your book, but we want people to know your story. We want people to know that you're black. And so they wanted to have her get her portrait done in order to, put it in the book and show that, this is a woman of color. So she remembered that when she lived in Boston, there had been a Reverend John Moorhead who owned a slave named Scipio Moorhead, who was both a portrait and an artist. And Scipio had actually learned how to become an artist from the Reverend's wife. So Whitley wanted Scipio to render her portrait. And this is the result. And here you can see, so this would have appeared on what's called the frontispiece, the very first page of the Book of Poems, and it's showing her sort of, contemplatively, pen in hand, looking off, waiting for inspiration to strike. So here we come back to Joshua Johnston, and sometimes you see it Johnston, sometimes you see it Johnson. And back in these days, the words were not standardized, so that's why you see a lot of crazy things from place to place. And you'll notice, so when we talk about a naive style, if we look here, so this, it's a child, but he's kind of given her adult proportions. Her head's a little bit too big, and her hands are kind of small. It's still a great likeness, and some people actually like the work better because it's what they call naive. As I said, there's a bit of white people exoticizing things. But we don't know a lot about Joshua Johnston's early life, but we do know he was a slave who had been freed by 1796 when he first advertised his talents as a portrait painter in the Baltimore Intelligencer, as someone who experienced many insuperable obstacles in pursuit of his studies. And today there's 80 paintings attributed to him, the most familiar dating between 1803 and 1814, and kind of a conservative painting style, very similar to, the colonial portraiture that was going on at the time. He was really good at capturing things like jewelry, as you can see from the necklace the little girl is wearing, and the lace, it's sort of transparent lace. He was really good at capturing little details. And so I told you we were going to come back to the Peel family. And what we see is that a lot of the sitters in Joshua Johnson's paintings also sat for Charles Peel Polk. And so some people think that Johnson may have been a slave of the Peel family, who were, as we know, a family of art collectors and painters. And in fact, Peel, his kids had names like Rembrandt and trying to remember. Anyway, he named his kids after famous Renaissance artists. So, recent evidence shows that Johnson was freed by his white father at the age of 19. Now, whether that means Peel was his genetic father, I don't know. But in any case, what's interesting, so here we have a painting of the same person, one that Charles Peel Polk did and one that Joshua Johnson did. And again, we don't know exactly with whom Johnson traded, but he certainly seemed to have a relationship with the Peels. And Charles Peel Polk was a nephew of Charles Wilson Peel. And the Peels, this Peel family, were Marylanders who moved to Philadelphia. And then Charles Peel Polk returned to Maryland in 1791. Yes, and his cousins Rembrandt and Raphael were advertising their services there by 1796. And Rembrandt set up his studio just around the corner from Joshua Johnson and then later moved opposite him. And they both created portraits of Ellen North Mall, where she's wearing possibly the same bonnet. And maybe even the artists were working side by side. And I actually think Joshua Johnson's is a lot better, maybe more honest. It looks like the Peel painting, he's trying to make this woman look like she's younger. Maybe he's trying to flatter her. I don't know. This is totally Professor Dominic's conjecture. Who knows? So no Baltimore artist of this period painted more children than Johnson did. That was really what he was known for. And typically what you see is people that are sitting frontally, which means they're facing us with their fronts, and they're staring straight out at us. And again, you've got the marvelous detail in the clothing, the lace, buttons, all of that. And that's, if you are somebody who's into fashion, this is the kind of thing that designers look at in art history, to look at the paintings of a particular time to see what people were wearing and get some inspiration. But what's also interesting is he's kind of created a completely unusual composition in this picture. So this is the Westwood children, and they are asymmetrical. You can't draw a line down the picture. They're not central to it. They are a little bit to the left, which gives them a bit more emphasis. But there's also, this interesting window back here, and then the family dog, bringing a present. Interesting. So that is my conclusion of chapter 1. As I said, there's not a lot in this chapter besides what I've talked about. Other chapters are going to be a lot longer, and what I will most likely do is break them up into chunks so that you're not like falling asleep in front of your computer. So I thank you for listening, and I bid you adieu for now.